Okay, everyone, welcome back. It's 1:30, and I'd like to go ahead and start our afternoon agenda. The first item on our on our agenda today is a report from Julia on unmanaged commercial landings. And Julia, if you're ready to go, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So I have a presentation that covers two topics. The first is the unmanaged landings report that the council reviews every year. And the second is an application for an exempted fishing permit for thread herring. So first off is the unmanaged landings report. This is something that the council has requested as a follow-on action to the unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment. So we've received these annual reports for the past few years. And the intent is to look for signs of developing unmanaged commercial fisheries, and then to decide if any further evaluation or consideration of a potential management action is needed. And GARFO helps us put together these reports every year. And this year, Ashley Weston from GARFO pulled together all the data that's in this, and she is on the line to help us answer questions about the data if needed. But so big shout out to Ashley at GARFO for doing the heavy data lift for this report this year. We really appreciate that. So what's in the report? The landings report contains commercial landings of species in locations where they are not managed at the state or federal level from Maine through North Carolina. And we're defining managed as having a possession limit, a size limit, a seasonal closure, and or limited access, all of these only in the commercial fishery. So if something has just a reporting requirement with no other associated measures, or just a permit requirement with no restrictions on who can obtain that permit, that didn't count as managed. So only the types of measures listed on the screen here count as management measures for the purpose of this report, and it's taken into consideration at the state level as well as managed by a council or the commission or NOAA fisheries. So anything that's in the report does not count as managed under that definition. The data comes from the ACCSP data warehouse, and it includes data from federally permitted dealers as well as state-only permitted dealers. So we do think this data set is pretty comprehensive. There should be no, noteworthy or substantial data gaps, and just, wanted to remind you that it does include data from dealers that do not have federal permits. So there's a lot of tables in the report, and I'll show them on later slides, but the tables summarize species with the highest unmanaged landings from 2015 through 2020 in this version of the report. It summarizes landings of the ecosystem component species, which are the ones that were part of the Forage Amendment. And there's tables focusing on species that have increasing landings. And jumping right into the tables, I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide. It's a lot to digest, but we wanted to show you this level of detail because part of the goal of the report is to, again, look for things that need further evaluation. A lot of this, when staff looks at it, we think maybe this doesn't necessarily look too alarming to us, but we want to provide you basically the raw data so that you could look at it yourself and come up with questions about what you want to know more about or suggestions for different ways to look at this. So this table is showing the top 25 species ranked in order of highest to lowest average unmanaged landings from 2015 through 2020. And there's a few instances where the data are confidential, meaning they represent fewer than 3 vessels and or dealers. So those are marked with a C, and those are not accounted for in the averages. So just to kind of touch on the highest of the high landings, I guess, in this table, mussels had the highest average landings across the entire time frame. And the highest landings in each individual year from 2015 through 2018. But in the most recent 2 years, blue catfish had the highest landings. And in terms of the overall time period, they're coming in at the second highest. average landing. So blue catfish are an invasive species, and we know that there's some programs in some states to kind of incentivize targeting of them. So maybe it's a good thing that they're ending up so high on this list. Hagfish are also, you can see, pretty high up on the list here. They were in the top 5 species by landings and weight every year from 2016 through 2020. This slide is the same thing as the previous slide, but it's only showing finfish species. So it's the same as before, but with a few other additions on there to get it at the top 25. They're just finfish. And this table shows the ecosystem component species. So the ecosystem component species are those that are subject to the possession limit that was implemented through the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment. And there are over 50 ecosystem component species, but not all of them show up in the dealer data. So this is just showing those that do show up in the dealer data. And like I said, we don't think the dealer data has any, noteworthy data gaps. So if there's anything that's not showing up in the data, that probably means that there's not noteworthy amounts of landings for it. And you can see here on the slide, again, several instances of confidential data, some instances of no landings. Honestly, when I look at this, I think these landings overall look pretty low, but we do provide this specific table every year just to help you keep track of what's happening with these Forage Amendment species. Again, they're all subject to a 1,700-pound trip limit that applies to combined landings of all of these species. So even though there is that possession limit, there could still be room for changes within that limit. So just, again, providing this as an opportunity to kind of keep track of things here. And then also something to note on this slide and also on some other slides, that, for example, you can see mollusks NK and herring NK. That means unknown. There are a few instances of things like that where it's not broken down to the species level. I think the intent behind the data is to be at the species level whenever possible, but there are some instances in here where it's groupings of species. And so in this case, we can't say for sure how much of that is herring species that are covered by the Forage Amendment versus other herring species or mollusk species, for example. So just another caveat to note with that specifically. Okay, so how do we look at whether a fishery is developing or not? Because that, again, was one of the council's goals with these reports, was to look for kind of an early warning sign of an unmanaged commercial fishery that might be developing. In this report, we have 2 ways of looking at that. And the first is looking at changes in rank order over time. So specifically increases in rank order over time. So the way we do that is for each year in the report, we rank it from highest to lowest, and then look at the change in that rank over time. So this is looking at landings of the species compared to each other, not necessarily looking at the specific like numerical change in the quantity of landings, but just how did they change over time relative to each other. And one of the reasons we thought this would be a helpful way to look at it is because it can be a way to highlight big movers. And the inspiration for this was for the, like Billboard Top 100 songs ranking, where you hear like, this song moved up 10 spots on the list this week. So that's kind of the intent behind this, is something like changing a lot. This could be a way to look at that. And then the other way that we looked at it is just consistently increasing landings over time. So this is just looking at changes in landings, not changes in rank compared to other species. And this can be used to capture steady, consistent increases regardless of the scale or the pace of the increase. So something could be slowly creeping up over time, and it might not be highlighted as a big mover based on rank, but it might still be worth knowing that there's a consistent but slow increase, or there could be a consistent but moderate or big increase. So this is a way of looking at those sorts of trends. And one reason why we did it both ways is to capture more species. So some species might have fallen into one of these categories, but not both. And we just wanted to provide you a few different ways of looking at things. And the document does highlight if something changed in rank order, or if it had consistently increasing landings either over the entire time series or just for the more recent years. So 2017 through 2020 is the more recent time period. And again, that's a way of kind of looking for things that might be more of like a change in recent years or something that's emerging in recent years versus something that's been occurring over this slightly longer time period. So this slide shows, again, that rank order comparison that I described. And the table here shows all of the species that had an increase in their rank order over the 2017 through 2020 time period. So that includes blue catfish, Atlantic cutlass fish, sugar kelp, oysters, Penaeid shrimp, bonito, mantis shrimp, armored sea robin, and gray triggerfish. And of those, 4 of them increased in rank order every year from 2015 through 2017, which is blue catfish, sugar kelp, oysters, and gray triggerfish. And the figure at the bottom here shows everything that's in that table above except for blue catfish, because you can see that blue catfish had a much higher scale of landings than the others, so it would kind of obscure all the other species if it was included in the figure. This is, again, just another way of looking at it. Confidential data are not shown in the figure, so you see some gaps there. And this can help show like the trend or the scale of the change in landings from year to year. You can see maybe there's some of them that might have had bigger changes than others, but again, from the staff perspective, looking at the overall scale of landings, not sure that this is necessarily anything that the council needs to worry about at this point in time, but it's you know, something that we'll monitor every year, and we can, you know, continue to track these landings over time. So this is that other way of looking at developing fisheries potentially, is species that had increasing landings each year from 2017 through 2020. So they had consistently increased landings. This includes Atlantic cutlass fish, oysters, Penaeid shrimp, green crab, sea urchins, mantis shrimp, Quahog, and armored sea robin. And there's some overlap with the previous table that I showed. So some species had increasing rank order and increasing landings each year, but there's some new additions on this table that weren't on the previous table. So green crabs, sea urchins, and Quahog, I think, are the ones that were not on the previous table. So like I said, one of the goals behind this report is to consider, you know, are there signs of a developing unmanaged commercial fisheries, and is it worth considering any sort of management response to that? But I think when thinking about that, it's important to think about what management are states already doing, and what are they considering doing in the future. So like I said, the reports do account for state level management, and every year we take it back out to the states and we say, have there been any changes in your management measures since the last report? And then we account for those changes each time we do the report. So thanks to all the states who have provided that information. So this summarizes some changes that were in management that were either effective in this report or might be effective for future reports. So again, this report summarized data through 2020. And this is just highlighting a few species that might be of interest. So sand lance might be of interest because they're one of the ecosystem component species, so they're part of the Forage Amendment. Massachusetts implemented a new possession limit for sand lance that was effective in May of 2020, so that is captured in the report, in the data that we show. And Rhode Island implemented a possession limit for sand lance that will be effective in 2021, so that'll be captured in next year's version of the report. Gray triggerfish showed up on the list of species with an increasing rank order every year from 2017 through 2020. There are species that Virginia has discussed the potential for management, but the preferred path forward for that species has not yet been determined for Virginia, but it's been considered. Penaeid shrimp showed up on the lists for both increasing rank order and increasing landings every year from 2017 through 2020. And there are a few states that are paying attention to Penaeid shrimp landings and considering management measures. So Virginia has had an experimental Penaeid shrimp fishery for a few years, and they are developing regulations to turn that into a limited access commercial fishery off Virginia Beach. And the fishery for those species in the eastern shore area of Virginia will remain an experimental fishery for now. Most landings are of white shrimp and, to a lesser extent, exotic tiger shrimp and brown shrimp. Maryland is also considering developing commercial management measures for Penaeid shrimp, but the preferred path forward has not yet been determined. So we thought that would just be some helpful context when thinking about, is there anything in this report that might warrant digging further into or thinking a little bit harder about? This was my last slide for the unmanaged landings report side of things. And like I said, Ashley Weston at Garfo helped pull together the data. She's on the line, can help answer questions if you want to know more about anything that was shown in there. We may or may not be able to answer it today. We sometimes have to look at the data to make sure that we're not showing confidential information, for example, but happy to take questions on any of that. I did have just 3 slides on the thread herring EFP. So I could go through those and then take questions on both at the end, or if you'd like, Mr. Chair, we can pause here and take questions just on the unmanaged landings report first.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I'd like to separate the two parts of the discussion. Let's take questions on the unmanaged commercial landings. You know, I did have a question regarding the definition of what's unmanaged. I saw on your table there were species like blue crab and whelk. You know, so what is the definition of unmanaged? Because, you know, here in Maryland and in the Chesapeake Bay, we certainly have management authority on blue crabs, and I wonder where that fits in as far as being part of this unmanaged fishery.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we, in this version of the report and last year's version of the report, we did filter out management at the state level. So it would take me a second to pull up the list and tell you what states are still in there for blue crab, but Maryland is definitely not counted in those landings. Blue crab is one where there's many states or several states where they're managed. So it's all filtered out, like all landings of blue crab in Maryland and the other states where blue crab are managed. Those are all filtered out, and that's the same species here. So anything here is just in states where they're not managed with one of those management measures that I listed on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That makes sense. And I also had a question for, I don't know if Tony Kearns or Bob Beal are on the call still, but the whelk fishery, the conchs, are something that I know we've talked about, you know, perhaps thinking about maybe putting them in the management realm. I don't know if Bob or Tony are here. We were thinking about doing something through ASMFC with you know, based on the fact that they're, you know, at the top of the list as far as landings go. I don't know if either of them are on the call. I just scrolled through my list. I didn't see their names. Maybe they dropped off. But Julie, are you aware of any discussions on you know, further development of a whelk management plan with the commission or within the at the federal level?
No, I wasn't aware of that, but there's a lot that I'm not aware of. And what I described on that slide with management measures that I was aware of that are under consideration, that's definitely not meant to be comprehensive. That's just from, I asked all states this year, do you have any updates to the list? And some responded and said, heads up, this is happening, but it definitely wasn't meant to be comprehensive. So
Gotcha.
Okay. But there definitely could be that or other.
Okay.
Already.
Yeah, and that's something that I can follow up with ASMFC on, because I know that there's been some discussion about that. Let me go around the table and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Peter Defer, I've got you first, and then Michelle Duvall, you're next. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Julia, for answering my questions of clarification earlier, and that, you know, most of them were the separation between fresh saltwater, state and federal, and regional differences, like Mike just pointed out with the blue crabs, because I don't think blue crabs are managed in Massachusetts where they do occur. But I'm curious about a definition of mollusks NK. Are we correct to assume that the unknown mollusks are either bivalves, so some form of clam or scallop, or gastropods, so conch swells or snails. So it's just those two mollusks, right?
I might have to defer to Ashley at Garfo on that one.
Okay.
I think there might have been some, I might have to double check. I remember in the Forage Amendment, there might have been like this, I'm not sure if it also includes, squids that could have been part of the Forage Amendment, but I would see if Ashley has an answer to that. And if not, we could follow up.
Okay.
This is Ashley. Let me just double check before I answer that question. Can you give me like 2 minutes?
Sure. Sure. The other question, I think Julia probably, if I might, Mr. Chairman, while she looks that up, are all of these species that are landed commercially then go into some form of market? Are they either go into the seafood market for human consumption or bait? Are all of those used in by the dealers? Do they all go into some sort of market?
I mean, these were all included in the dealer landings reports. So it must have been sold to a dealer. I think, again, this might be a better question for Ashley in terms of if that's possible to look at in the data. We haven't done that in the past. Look at like what, where it went after it went to the dealer, but these were all, showed up in dealer reports.
Okay, so I mean, my assumption was that if the dealer is buying it from off the boat, then they have a use for it. They can sell it. It can go somewhere. They're not just going to buy stuff off the boat and then throw it away, right?
Presumably.
Yeah. Okay. But there were just a couple things there that I thought, gee, what are they doing with like blood arc clams? I know those species. I'm sure that's just for bait.
So this is actually, again, to answer your first question, it's defined as mollusca, so that would be to the phylum level.
So it could be any one of the 7 things. So it could be squid and octopus and monoplaciflora and it could be any of them.
Presumably.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Peter, for your questions. Ashley, thank you for looking that up so quickly and getting back to Peter on that. I have Michelle Duvall next. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both Julia and Ashley for all the work in putting this together. And I guess my question's a little bit broader. I mean, I know we receive these reports on commercial landings of unmanaged species because the Unmanaged Forage Amendment, is specifically focused on, halting or preventing new commercial fisheries, for these species before the council had the opportunity to just review information. But, has the council ever discussed also receiving information on recreational harvest of any of these species? And I just ask about that because I think it might provide a more complete picture of what's going on with regard to, maybe importance of some of these species to recreational fisheries and just, overall use patterns. Thanks.
That hasn't really, I'm sure the question has been raised at previous versions of presentations of this annual report, but there hasn't been like a specific request by the council to do something similar for recreational harvest.
I guess I just might encourage us to think about that. It's not something we need to, take action on, but I do, again, think it might provide just a more complete picture of everything for our consideration. Thanks.
Yeah, so Michelle, let me ask you, so where would it be the APIS program that would identify that? Like where would be what would where's the information going to come from the recreational community? Is it going to be volunteer surveys?
I mean, my
I'm
thoughts
just
were
wondering,
really just,
I'm wondering where the information comes from and
Yeah, no-
how we coordinate it.
yeah, no, I mean, my thought was just, you know, query the MRIP information. I mean, similar to how the dealer reports are queried. I mean, it's not, I'm not trying to get into a protracted discussion about that. I just think that if we're thinking about recognizing that, you know, a lot of these species are probably used as bait by the recreational fishing sector, but I think it might be useful to, you know, to provide, like I said, more of a complete picture of overall use and importance of some of these species. That's all. So, I mean, really, honestly, MRIP, which I know is a kind of a dirty four-letter word for some folks, would be the one information source that I was thinking of. Thanks.
All right, that makes sense. All right, thank you for that. All right, next I have Chris Batsavage. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And yeah, thank you, Julie, for the presentation, and Ashley for compiling all the data. Yeah, just before I ask my questions to Michelle's point, I think that's an interesting thing to explore in terms of species that are unmanaged in the mid-Atlantic, having more of a presence in the area by looking at the recreational harvest. Curious to see what it would look like. And I think some of the species might be more rare event species that, you know, anecdotally we may hear about being caught in the mid-Atlantic, but just not showing up in MRIP just due to the you know, infrequent nature of them at the time. Others others might surprise us. So a question, and I'm going to apologize in advance if this question's been answered in past times you've presented this, Julia, but things such as sugar kelp and oysters, is that only wild harvest, or does that also include any kind of aquaculture harvests in those in the Mid-Atlantic and in New England states? I have a unrelated question after that.
I know that came up in a previous iteration of the report, and I apologize that I can't remember what the answer to that is. I think the answer was that there might be a code in the data to indicate if it came from aquaculture, but I don't recall if we did actually filter that out. And I'm not sure if Ashley can provide more information on that in terms of like, did we filter out aquaculture landings?
This is Ashley. I can double check and let you know for sure, but off the top of my head, I don't believe we would have filtered out if landings were coming from aquaculture. It would just be if it was sold to a dealer, you know, we would see it show up here in our report.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and it's kind of we have that with oysters here in North Carolina, where we have a wild harvest and an aquaculture component. And yes, didn't know how that was handled for this. Second question is regarding it's the Panage shrimp landings occurring more in the Mid Atlantic region. I noticed last year, I guess working just kind of following what our shrimp fishery was doing out in the ocean, and also some of the Kitty Hawk wind energy area activities, that some shrimp trawlers started operating outside 3 miles off Virginia, and didn't know if those landings were going into Virginia, if they showed up in like Virginia's landing as being landed by, you know, in Virginia, or those you know, heading back down into North Carolina and places like that. May not have an answer. Just wondered if you knew off the top of your head. Thanks.
So my understanding is that the landings should be associated with the state where the dealer is based, in terms of how we ran the report, and then it's filtered out based on whether that species was managed in the state where it's landed. So if it's like a North Carolina boat landing in Virginia, those landings would count towards Virginia. And if that species is managed in Virginia, then it would be filtered out.
Okay, so I guess just the information from the dealer wouldn't give like kind of the general location of where those landings would occur, whether it be a stat area or just, you know, simply like federal waters off a certain state. You know, again, I'm not familiar with how how this data is compiled in other states. I just familiar with how it's compiled in North Carolina.
Yeah, I think some of that data is, available, but that's not how we like reported it here. We're not this report doesn't look at, if it was state or federal waters or if it was like caught off of one state and landed in a different state. This is just focusing on where it was landed.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for that. Thanks for the questions, Chris. Last question, I'm going to go to Wes Townsend. Go ahead, Wes.
Thank you, Mike. I was just curious, under the rock crab, huge landings in 2015, and they've fallen drastically since. Is that probably because the fishermen and the dealers are finally identifying them correctly? Has that been looked into at all?
It could be. I'm just trying to open up my spreadsheet of the things that we filtered out, and if that was something that was filtered out in all years or just in some of the years. So I know it could be that. Sorry, this is taking longer than I thought it would. Yeah, so I guess rock crab, in terms of management, it should be filtered out in all years that are in this report. So I don't think there was a change in management that should have impacted that. So maybe it was, I guess I couldn't really say why there's that that big decrease from 2015 going into the other year. So I mean, your guess is better than mine in that case, but if there's a desire to look further into any of this, we can definitely do that.
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Wes. Thanks, Ashley. Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question similar to Wes's, just looking at this table, and I meant to ask you this earlier before the meeting, Julia, but if you look at a species like quahog and you see that there were 3 million pounds in 15 and 3 million pounds in 16, and then we're down at 23,000 in 2019, what's the interpretation of that? Is it those quahogs are now being managed? They weren't managed before, or quahogs are leaving the planet, or what's the deal?
So quahogs is another one where there wasn't a change in management across the time period shown here, or at least not a change that got captured in the data. So what we have in terms of what we filtered out for quahogs was the same across all of these years. So again, that's about all I can say, is that it wasn't if it wasn't a management change that we're capturing anyway. So again, we could dig deeper into that. I'm not sure if there's something else happening there. Environmental market factor. I mean, who knows what, but again, all I can say is there wasn't a change in how we filtered quahogs across these years. It was filtered the same way across all those years. So yeah, it was a management change. It's not something that we applied here.
So yeah, thanks, Julia. And just, Mr. Chair, if I could, I think when we see this information, we could use it that way too. There may be some concern that we have to, looking at quahogs, or maybe an environmental issue that we need to know about, right? So maybe looking into that one would be helpful. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I have similar concerns, not concerns, but just I have some questions about where the data are drawn from, especially with things like oysters and, like I mentioned before, with blue crab. This is all good information, generating discussion, which we've had plenty of at this point. I'm going to take one or two more comments or questions at this point, and then we're going to turn over to to Julia's next section on thread herring. So let's go ahead. Ellen Boland, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Ellen, if you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Wanted to provide some answers to the questions I think Chris was asking about shrimp. So some of the landings are reported in Virginia. We don't have the ocean numbers from offshore yet in 2020, but to give you sort of a snapshot from 2019, I think it was about 300,000 from the offshore in 2019, and then about 400,000 pounds from the experimental fishery we have. So that means we're headed for about the million-pound mark for shrimp. And as Julia mentioned, we are switching this from an experimental fishery to a fully prosecuted fishery in Virginia with all the bells and whistles that come with it. And then also a note on the blue catfish, this was also mentioned, Virginia also has a targeted fishery for blue catfish. We have an electrofish fishery that switched from experimental to a fully prosecuted fishery. I believe it was 2020, but the dates are a little fuzzy, but just to give people some information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. And, I'll just let everybody know for transparency's sake, we in Maryland are working on, we're using Virginia's shrimp fishery as kind of a basis for perhaps developing our own targeted and directed shrimp fishery on the coast for Maryland. They're more and more present each year. We do not have an interest in developing anything further in the Chesapeake Bay, other than the gears that are already allowed to be used by commercial fishermen. But on the coast, we have some ideas about how we might develop a targeted fishery. So kind of like Virginia has done, we're working with them closely and trying to come up with something for that. So you may see some increases in Panade shrimp landings in the coming years as we work through that. So just wanted to put that out there for everybody. Chris and Ellen, your hands are still up. Chris, did you have something else you wanted to offer? All right. His hand went down. Is there anybody else from the council that wants to ask any questions or make any comments regarding the unmanaged commercial landing section of this discussion? All right, seeing none. Julia, you wanted to step through the EFP on thread herring. That was your last point of this agenda item, right?
Yes.
Okay. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
All right. So the thread herring is one of the species that are part of the Forage Amendment. So they're subject to that possession limit through the Forage Amendment. They're an ecosystem component species. And Lund's Fisheries submitted an application to GARFO for an exempted fishing permit to exempt them from that possession limit for thread herring. The intent behind this proposal is to demonstrate the potential for federal waters purse seine fishery for thread herring. And the proposal suggests that the experimental fishing would take place next year in 2022 from about May through November. And the intent is for it to be at the same time of year in the same place as the New Jersey Menhaden purse seine fishery. So that's typically from about Ocean City, Maryland to Montauk, New York, according to the proposal. And the application recommends or requests that this exempted fishery be allowed a 3,000 metric ton or 6.6 million pound total catch limit to apply to the whole exempted fishery in 2022. And that it's anticipated that each trip could land 80 to 100,000 pounds. But again, my read of the intent is that would stay within that overall catch limit of 3,000 metric tons is what's requested. And that there would also be biological sampling of all the Atlantic thread herring catch. So that includes length and weight sampling that could be useful in the future for things like attempting to assess the stock or learn any more about the population. And the proposal or the application also suggests that any bycatch on these trips would be recorded. So again, thread herring are part of the Forage Amendment. The goal of the Forage Amendment was to prohibit the development of new and expansion of existing directed commercial fisheries on unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters until the council has had an adequate opportunity to assess the scientific information relating to any new or expanded directed fisheries and consider potential impacts to existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem. And when the council took final action on the Forage Amendment in 2016, they agreed that use of an exempted fishing permit and council review of that exempted fishing permit should be a first step towards considering expanded fisheries for the Forage Amendment species. So the goal is not to totally prohibit expansion of these fisheries forever, but to only consider expansion after considering the potential impacts on these, these various things described here. So the ecosystem, communities, existing fisheries. So just kind of generally in terms of process, the process that's being followed here, where LUNS is submitting an application for an EFP, there's the opportunity for the council to review that. That's consistent with the process side of things, with how the council preferred that these things be considered in the future under the Forage Amendment. So the application for the EFP was provided by LUNS to include in the briefing book. GARFO, as far as I know, is processing that application, and they will publish a Federal Register notice with an associated comment period. But the timing of that, as far as I know, is still to be determined. And just the general process with exempted fishing permits is, GARFO is the one who would review and approve or deny the permit. And the council can provide comments on whether or not to issue that exempted permit. So the council's role here is basically limited to providing comments, and it's up to GARFO ultimately to approve or deny the permit. And because that Federal Register notice hasn't yet been published, there's not necessarily anything to comment on quite yet, but we know that it's coming. So we wanted to make sure that we talk about this at a council meeting, give the group a heads up that this is coming. LUNS was kind enough to provide their application to the council so you can see it ahead of time before this Federal Register notice is published. Again, the exact timing of the comment period is uncertain, but it might not line up with a future council meeting. There might not be an opportunity to talk about this again, like at the August council meeting, for example. So that's why we thought it would be important to talk about it now in case the comment period ends before the next council meeting. So what council staff are recommending for the path forward for this is today to just talk about, does the council want to potentially write a comment letter on this? We don't need to decide today what those comments are, just do you want to talk about writing a comment letter? And if so, staff suggests that we work through the Ecosystem Ocean Planning Committee to do that. So once that Federal Register notice is published, once we know when the comment period deadline is, and once we have that actual notice to comment on, then we can work on maybe scheduling a committee meeting, or if the committee wants to handle it over email, that's fine too. But again, right now, all we really need is direction on in terms of, does the council think this approach could work? Do you want to submit a comment letter? Do you think it's worth working through the Ecosystem Ocean Planning Committee to do that? And I think that's all I had for the EFP. I did want to point out that we got 3 comments for the briefing book related to this. 2 were posted as supplemental, and 1 is in the form that's on the website for kind of late breaking comments. And all 3 comment letters expressed concern about the application in terms of the scale of the potential landings, the lack of detail on data that might be collected, and concerns about what it means for the Forage Amendment. But again, we're not really at the point in time where there's the actual Federal Register notice to comment on. So I don't know that the group today needs to really get into the specifics of what you might say in a comment letter. But it would be helpful for staff if you could at least indicate whether you do think it would be worth writing a comment letter or not. And I'll leave it with that, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Yeah, so we have some things to discuss here, some decisions to make. I'm going to go to Tony Delernia first with his hand up. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Julia, threadfin herring are listed in our, as you, unmanaged forage fish amendment. And so in order to, the agency to accept the threadfin herring in that amendment, they must provide forage for a number of species that are managed by the Mid-Atlantic. I know that they're very important forage in the Gulf and in the South Atlantic. But could you tell me offhand what species in the Mid-Atlantic that are managed by the Mid are dependent upon threadfin herring as a forage species? That's my first question. I have a few others, Mr. Chairman, and perhaps a comment after I get the answers to my questions. So my first question is, what critters that we manage eat threadfins?
Great question. And I'm just opening up the Forage Amendment EA to see what we have in that. And I did find it. So this was written in 2017 based on analysis done before that. So this, might not be the most up-to-date information, but we did provide. Okay, so this table in the document, thread herring is one of the species that you probably remember from the Forage Amendment. There was a lot of discussion about, like, can we identify this to the species level and stomach contents, and we can't always do that. So this was kind of lumped in with the herrings and sardines grouping in terms of like stomach contents, basically. So what we had in the Forage Amendment EA is that monkfish, bluefish, summer flounder, black sea bass, and spiny dogfish were all listed as predators of unmanaged herrings and sardines. So just with a really quick look through this document, I don't know that we have it down to much greater detail than that.
I understand. Okay, Julia, that's fine there. Thank you. Well, let me ask you this now. As far as the large pelagics are concerned, the large pelagics that occur in the Mid-Atlantic region, if the threadfin herring provided forage for those large pelagics, the smaller tunas, large tunas, would that be also be grounds for including it as a in the Forage Fish Amendment?
Yeah, that was discussed. Let me just pull over this table and show you what it said, because that was definitely a topic of consideration in the Forage Amendment. So here's the unmanaged herrings and sardines grouping. So this lists council managed predators, and then we did include a list of HMS and seabird predators and protected species predators. So you can see there's a number of those other predators listed here. Again, this is grouped at the level of unmanaged herrings and sardines. I do recall definitely some public comment saying that thread herring were important for some HMS predators, but what's on the screen here is the level of detail that we provided in the Forage Amendment.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, what are the months that they are normally occurring in the Mid-Atlantic region, the threadfin herring?
I can't answer that question off the top of my head.
Okay. All righty. You also had a slide in your presentations in which you had looked like the landings of threadfin herring in the past few years when you showed landings. Can you bring that slide up again? All right. So Atlantic herring, Atlantic threadfin. So this is in pounds, tons. What is this? These numbers here.
Sorry about that. This is all in pounds.
That's all in pounds. So the average was 18,476 pounds from 2015 to 2020 average landings of Atlantic threadfin herring. Okay, 18,476 pounds. And what's the application asking for in the number of pounds for 1 year?
6.6 million.
Okay. So 6.6 million. All righty. Mr. Chairman, I have a comment I'd like to make, and if you want to take comments now, if you want to take additional questions, but based on my line of questioning to Julia here, I am prepared to make a comment, not a motion, because I know you don't need motions at this. You can't take motions at this point because we're not We don't have the proposal yet officially, but I am prepared to make a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony. Go ahead and make your
All right.
comment.
All right, thank you very much. To me, it's very clear that threadfin herrings are an important forage species for the species that we manage, as well as the highly migratory species in our area, both the commercial aspect, from a commercial aspect, and from a sport fishing aspect. Threadfin herring are extremely important as a forage base. The average take is 18,476 pounds a year for the past 5 years. An increase to 6.6 million pounds is a significantly exponential increase that would, in my mind, clearly have localized depletion, which would affect the species that we manage. And it's almost like a 350, 360-fold increase. And I cannot support this type of an increase. It's just to me, it's unreasonable. It's why we put the Forage Fish Amendment in place, because we said we did not want to have a very rapid expansion on a forage species that our other species are dependent upon. And this application violates, I believe, one of the goals of the Forage Fish Amendment. And so I could never support this type of an application at this time. Thank you, sir.
All right, Tony, thank you. Let me see who else we have on the list here. Is there anyone else from the council that wants to offer any thoughts before I go to the public? Kate Wilkie, go ahead, Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of the council having a discussion through the EOP committee and putting together some comments to submit to NIMS on this issue. I think based on the 2-page application that we see in the meeting materials, it looks like the science might be a little light, and the requirement, or the council's unmanaged forage amendment specifically says that developing fisheries, we need to be able to understand the impacts to the marine ecosystem and to communities. So yeah, I'd be interested in having further discussion on this. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kate. I've got a lot of hands up at this point. It went from nothing to, there's about 6 or 7 people. I'm going to stick with the committee. I'm sorry, with the council at this point. Let's go, and then I'll go to the public after that. And I just want to give everybody a time check. We're about a half an hour over our agenda at this point, so let's try to keep your comments succinct and to the point. I'm going to go to Peter Defer and then Joe Cimino next, and then I'll step through to Mike Pentney, Michelle Duvall, and Adam Nowalski. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think Tony and Kate make excellent points that I'm completely in agreement with. And as chair of the EOP committee, I think we'd be happy to convene and discuss and take more information in. I've already had conversations with a few council members who share these levels of concern. I'd like to hear what Garfo says about the potential for having a new species to manage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. And I think the EOP plays a big role here and could be, I like the idea of having a committee meeting to develop comments for a letter as far as comment to this request. Joe Cimino. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, no, I just want to put my word. I agree with everything that Kate said, and look forward to having these discussions on the EOP committee.
Yeah. All right. Good. Thanks, Joe. Mike Pentney, you're up next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just in regards to, the deliberations of the EOP committee, I appreciate that they're going to think about this. And as staff mentioned, we haven't yet published an FR notice. I believe we're still kind of working with the applicant to make sure that we fully understand the rationale for the exemptions that are being requested, as well as the planned scope and scale of the project, and what they hope to learn from fishing under an EFP. But I would just simply request that, as the council or the committee engage in this discussion, one thing that will be very helpful to us is there a level of harvest that the council, the committee would find acceptable? Because that might give us a baseline for discussion with the applicant. If there's a way, if there was a lower level of harvest, if 6.6 million pounds is conclusion you reach is 6.6 million pounds is too much at this time, based on what we know, is there a lower level of harvest that might be considered appropriate by the committee and the council? That would help us with our review. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think we can certainly do that. I'll lead that. I'll put that on staff to make that part of the discussion with the EOP. Okay, let me see who else we have here. Michelle Duvall, and then Adam Nowalski, and then I'll go to the public. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just echoing Kate's comments, I do think we need a little more information and the opportunity to have a more robust discussion about the proposed EFP, and the opportunity to provide some constructive comments, as Mr. Pettany mentioned in his comments as well. And I'll just note that this is how some other councils also review EFPs of this nature, and would just note that they're I think the Pacific Council even includes some SSC review. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Appreciate that. Adam?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I certainly think the EOP committee is the right place to discuss this when it's time to discuss this. And I'm not familiar enough with this process to know when the right time is for them. Does that need to wait until this gets to the point of the FR? Does this need to occur beforehand? So I think we need to give some consideration to what is the right time to get the EOP engaged. And I would also offer that if we are going to get the EOP engaged, we should make a point to make sure we fully understand the application, working with the applicant. I think that 2 pages of information here is probably insufficient for any of us to be drawing a conclusion today about the impacts or intent of this. So whatever we'd have to do to gather the information ahead of time to make sure we fully understand what it is that we're discussing, what input we're giving, and making sure we're giving that input at the right time, I think it's really important that we go through that process.
All right, thanks, Adam. And, I'll turn to Chris. I think Chris can work with staff and with Garfo to determine what the appropriate timing would be for an EOP meeting and a response from the EOP, or actually, a letter or a memo from EOP. I'm not going to put him on the spot at this point, but I think we can figure that out, Adam, to make sure that we've got the timing right. So thanks for your comments. I appreciate it. With that said, I don't have anybody else from the council at this time. I'm going to step through a couple comments from the public. I'd ask you to just, in the interest of time, and given the discussion that we've had, we definitely have a plan forward as to providing comment to this request. And so I'd ask you to try to be quick in your, not quick, but try to keep your comments focused on the topic at hand, and maybe, limit your comments to a minute or two as we go, so we can finish out this item on the agenda. Jeff Kalin, I have you first, and then I have George Jackman, and then Pam. as a third, and then I'm going to cut it off after Pam. So go ahead, Jeff, you're up first. You might be on mute, Jeff, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, I was. Sorry about that.
There you go. I got you. We hear you now.
Apologize. So thanks for the consideration today. I hope that I had a little bit more time. I did provide more information than what is in that was posted to Julia and Chris. We gave you everything that we've provided to Allie Pitts. Allie Pitts and I have been going back and forth. I'm the project coordinator. It's Lund's Fisheries and H.L. Axelson Inc. We would use 4 pairs of boats catching and landing that are limited access boats in the Menhaden fishery inside. We're limited to 900-foot seine. To go outside in the deeper water, we would need a bigger seine. Those are, tens of thousands of dollars a piece. We don't expect to outfit all 4 pairs initially, but that's some of that detail is in the documentation. The sampling also significant detail matching what we've done in chub mackerel, and of course SSC's comments on the chub mackerel data collection that we've been doing is that it's a primary source of information and could be valuable for future stock assessments and so forth. I don't have time to go through what we have provided for you. There's 3 papers. 2 are historical. One from '73, which talks about the interaction of the purse seine and thread herring in the Menhaden fishery in the South Atlantic. And this is the same fish that exists in the Gulf of Mexico. And interestingly, Dr. Hood, who's on our SSC, has done a lot of research. So I think the idea of going to the SSC is a great idea. I think Dr. Hood can understand the scale of the value of these 2 million pounds of fish to the pelagics and so forth. I don't think any of them are dependent on thread herring. I think we'd have to agree that thread herring is one of many things that they eat. The third paper documents 26 years of surveys in New Jersey that demonstrate that there's 18 or more southern affiliated species emerging into the region. And that's an interesting paper that came out of Rutgers in 2019. So, that's essentially what we're up to. There is more information that can be provided. I talked to Mike earlier. The last thing I'll say is, and this, if I just have one more minute, and this goes to Mr. Ball's questions earlier about other landings data. I received information from Julia, which you don't have today. I got it when I started this process that in fact 3 million pounds of these fish are landed in Florida. That was in 2017. So it's not just the 18,000 pounds. And keep in mind, since the Forage Amendment went into effect, and I'm very proud of having been a council member when that happened, we limited the possession of all of these species together to 1,700 pounds. So you're not going to see any recent landings because we're not allowed to keep them. We have to throw them away. So I look forward to the meeting of the EOP. I think that's a great idea. We wanted to get this to you early because we knew this was your unmanaged forage agenda item and it would not come up again until a year from now. Hopefully we can work with Garfo for a comment period that will match one of your future council meetings. And hopefully we'll be able to get to the SSC to have a discussion about the request between now and then. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the time. I'm happy to answer any questions too, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate your comments. You may get some questions, but I'm not sure today's the time for that. You might, I would suggest that if council members have questions for Jeff, to reach out to him directly after the meeting. And you guys can, talk between yourselves on questions that you might have. I'm going to go next to George Jackman. George, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, council members. My name is George Jackman. I'm the Senior Habitat Restoration Manager for Riverkeeper. We represent 55,000 members, and we protect the drinking water of 10 million people in New York City and the Hudson Valley. We're very concerned about this emerging fishery. It's a high-volume fishery using a 2,000-foot net, 180-foot deep. It's going to be operating off the coast of New York, and we're just wondering, is it conceivable that high-value sport fish, pelagics, striped bass, bluefish, river herring, and shad would be picked up in these large nets? There's no observer coverage. We must remind the council that every single Hudson River fish, iconic fish, is in long-term decline. Our river herring and shad are depleted and are showing no signs of recovery. And we think that there would be a significant amount of bycatch in this fishery. And at this time, we're vehemently opposed to a new fishery of this size and magnitude operating off the coast of New York. Especially at a time when we don't have no information on the ecosystem impacts of this fishery. So that's basically what I have to say, but can you answer that question? Is it conceivable that striped bass, bluefish, and river herring and shad could be occur as bycatch in this fishery?
Yeah, George, I can't answer that for you. I'm not exactly sure how this fishery would operate. I don't know if staff would like to offer anything to that. I mean, as far as the exempted fishing permit goes, I mean, there would be sampling and bycatch would be recorded. It's kind of a learning process, I think. I see Mike Pentney's hand up. Maybe Mike has something he might want to offer. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's one of the questions that we would ask, and one of the things that we would be interested in learning if we were to approve and issue an exempted fishing permit for any kind of developing fishery or expanding fishery or new gear type. An exempted fishing permit is generally one of the first steps that we utilize to learn how the fishery would operate and what the unanticipated impacts might be, including the degree of potential bycatch and which species would be affected. So, that would be part of the information that we would gather with the applicant through the EFP, were we to decide that we could approve it.
All right, thanks, Mike.
This is George again. And just one thing
go ahead,
I
George.
might add that, the size of this net alone would be sufficient enough to just completely wipe out any one of the systems of the creeks, the natal, I guess, the return of some of our migratory species. Again, they're down, according to Waldman and Lindbergh 2009, they're down 99 percentile. And again, they're not showing signs of recovery. We cannot afford any bycatch. Another high volume fishery of this size has potential to have tremendous impacts to our recovering species. And that's why we're deeply concerned about this.
No, I appreciate that, George. And what I would suggest is that you follow the council process through the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee, which I expect that we will have a committee meeting to develop some comments on this. And that would be an opportunity for you to weigh in as a member of the public
Okay.
as they debate this.
Our members are very concerned about this fishery.
Understood. Yeah, I understand. Thank you. I appreciate your comment today.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to go next to Pam. And after Pam, we're going to wrap this up and move on to the next to our next agenda item. Go ahead, Pam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. This is Pam Lyons-Groman, the Executive Director of Wild Oceans. Thank you for the discussion today. And I just want to clarify the process that you've put in place, because when staff was giving the presentation and provided the recommendation, there were two pathways that were expressed for the EOP committee. The first was an email exchange to work on a comment letter, And the second was a meeting, which I'm assuming would be a meeting that's publicly noticed and the public is invited to provide comments for. And I just wanted to be sure we are heading down that second option. I just want to confirm that with you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, you know, Pam, my choice would be the latter, to have a publicly open to have a meeting of the committee that's announced and allows for public comment. I'll ask Chris Moore, since Chris, you know, as our executive director, would be responsible for putting that meeting together, whether or not he thinks that's something we can pull off in the coming months.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would agree with that. We still have some uncertainty as to exactly what's going to happen with this. As Mike Penny indicated, that they're still in the review process of the application. Some point there's going to be a Federal Register notice. We'll have a period of time after that Federal Register notice is published to comment. We may want to be proactive and put something in the FR next week for an EOP meeting. Just thinking out loud, but yeah, I think the process as Pam outlined it would work fine.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Chris.
I
Yes,
appreciate that,
hopefully
Mr.
that
Chairman.
hopefully that helps you, Pam, with the understanding that there'll be an opportunity for public comment, you know, directly to this issue as we prepare comments for the National Marine Fisheries Service in moving forward with the CFP.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just one more quick follow-up to
Uh-huh.
that. So, you know, for us, for an EFP to be filed under the spirit of the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus, and we're one of the groups that certainly worked collaboratively with industry and the council to create that document, which we're all very proud of, the result of that document. But for an EFP to be approved under it, I believe it has to meet the objectives, the purpose of that amendment. And if the exempted fishing permit is not collecting scientific information to understand those impacts to existing fisheries, to non-target species, to fishing communities and the marine ecosystem, I just don't believe it meets the spirit of it. As written, we could not support this EFP. I understand that there is more information that will be coming forward, and I will continue to follow this process. And thank you for working on the timing of this. It seems a bit tricky, but I have all confidence that you'll get it done. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Pam. All right. I saw Mike Penny's hand come up. Go ahead, Mike. You have the last word before we adjourn on this one.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess 2 points. The one, just to respond to Pam's last comment there, closing comment. Just to confirm, there's nothing in the regulations that followed the Forage Amendment that supersede or override our pre-existing regulations for evaluating and approving exempted fishing permits. You know, the process to engage the council is in there, but it's not, you know, it doesn't change the parameters that we would use to evaluate an EFP application. But in terms of the overall process, you know, generally what we like to do for EFPs, and this applies to any EFP, not just this one, is get the package in, you know, kind of final form, and that often entails some negotiation and work with the applicant to refine the scope and scale and purpose of the project, and then we like to get that figured out and then publish an FR notice so that the public, including the councils, is weighing in on what the EFP would actually look like. And so I'm suggesting that possibly one approach, and this would have to be something that Lunds was also amenable to, would be for the EOP committee to meet sooner and think through the application as it currently stands, and think about what level of fishing activity and sort of what parameters would the EOP committee feel comfortable putting on the EFP, if any, and then providing that input to us, NIMF, so that we can work with ones to see if they'd be willing to refine the EFP application along those lines. Then once we have everything worked out with Lunds to their satisfaction and our satisfaction, we would publish an FR notice that we could then get the full committee or full council to weigh in on as we normally do with EFP applications. And the reason I say that, I think it would save us a step if we were to publish an FR notice for the EFP as it currently stands, and the council came back with and said, well, if you did this, this, and this, we'd be okay with it. But we've already published an FR notice. It's a little bit more time consuming to then go back, revise the EFP application, which may prompt us to have to republish an FR notice and go through the comment process again. It's also possible that if we refine the EFP with the applicant, that might change the level of NEPA review that would be required before we could issue an EFP. And that's one of the reasons why we try to get that refinement done in advance, so that we don't have an applicant say spinning their wheels, developing a more comprehensive NEPA review, and then later changing the EFP such that that level of review wouldn't have been necessary. So just a suggestion in terms of the timing and the process that might help us together with Lunds and the council work through this issue. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that, Mike. Can I just assume that you'll work with Chris and staff of the council to try to figure out the best timing for when comments would be best delivered to you?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Is there anybody else from the council that has any questions or comments at this point? Okay, seeing no hands, I want to thank Julia for your presentation today. We're a little bit over our time limitations on this agenda item, but I think it was important that we had that discussion. And let's see what we've got next here. It's 2:50. Let's go ahead. What I'd like to do next is to jump into the habitat update instead of taking a break at this point. Jessica Coakley is going to give us an update on habitat.